Ashani, did anyone ever teach you how to rest?
Definitely not.
That's the thing. In this society we're in, we're taught how to be productive. There are 1,000,001 videos about how to be in the top 1% of high performers, etc. But who teaches you how to rest? Who teaches you what downtime really looks like and how it tailors to who you are as a person? We're kind of all just blindly going about things, hoping that it'll work out.
Hello, Shuktika. Welcome to But Are You Happy? I am so excited to dive into the topic of all things rest with you.
Thank you so much for having me on.
You know, it's really interesting because I think we're in a time where I feel like everyone is burning out. Like, I feel like I can get burnt out, my friends, family. And I think when we unpack it all, I think it's important to talk about rest and what that actually looks like. So, you know, from your perspective as a clinical psychologist, like, what does true rest actually look like?
What an incredible conversation to be having today in the sort of society that we live in. The topic of rest feels so necessary and yet so elusive, shall we say. When we think of rest, I want you to imagine it to be like charging your phone. You can plug it in, but if there are 40 apps that are continuously running in the background, that battery is barely going to move. And so from a psychology perspective, true rest actually needs two things in order for it to take place. The first is for the body to stop. And the second is that the mind actually needs to switch out of what we call the high alert mode. Now, what that means is that a nap with your mind racing doesn't count. And a holiday where your mind is on your inbox also doesn't count. And what we know from the research on stress and recovery is that when both the body and the mind have that shift down, the brain can actually have that slow repair process that it needs to consolidate all of the information it's gathered throughout the day. And that second part, which is the shifting out of the high alert zone, that's actually the part that most of us skip.
You know, when we think about rest, we just do think about the physical rest, like, oh, I'm just going to lay down, have a nap, but we are still wired. I mean, I can speak from my experience. So why is it that, I know you talked about physical rest and there being a difference between physical rest and mental rest, but why is it that so many of us miss the mark on the mental side of things?
Yeah, I think there's actually a really helpful framework here that might allow us to step away from physical versus mental and look at a little more broadly. So there's an American physician, Dr. Dalton Smith, and she did some really interesting research in this space, and she actually coined it to be 7 different types of rest.
Wow.
I know. So she talks about physical rest, mental rest, emotional rest, sensory rest, creative rest, social rest, and spiritual rest. So if you were thinking you weren't doing enough, let's just add more to the list.
We need to do rest well.
Now, the reason why her framework has actually caught on so well is that most of us may feel like we're doing okay with the physical rest side of things. You know, we're lying down, we think we're getting some sleep, but we're actually falling short on a lot of the others. Sensory rest, for example, is a really key one, and that's where your nervous system needs to switch off after a day of constant notifications, emails, dings, social media. And most of us never get any sensory rest in our day. And it's the same with mental rest, where your thinking actually stops, and emotional rest, for example, where you stop absorbing other people's concerns and issues and trying to help them. And this is where I'm going to throw in a tip nice and early.
Love this.
I love suggesting the idea of what we call a brain dump. Now, the reason why a brain dump is so helpful is that the brain is designed to create ideas, but not to store them. And when it feels like it needs to keep storing, that internal filing cabinet doesn't have the ability to refresh itself. And so doing a brain dump actually tells your brain, I'm allowing it to exit from here onto this paper, which means you can have a moment to breathe before we then process what we do with what's on the paper. Absolutely love doing a brain dump.
But Are You Happy is like that brutally honest friend whose advice you'll actually want to take. This season, we explore the psychology of perfectionism, how you can stop taking things so personally, and why group chats can feel so draining, plus what you can do about it. Our friends at Medibank understand that connection matters, especially during challenging times. That's why they've created the Medibank Family Roast, a card game designed to get families actually talking and connecting with each other. Because when family bonds are stronger, Australia is stronger. So get together and play the Medibank Family Roast. Search Medibank Family Roast. Live better with Medibank. Coming back to it, because you did say there were 7 different types and you kind of listed them off. And I'm sure there's people listening in being like, which kind of rest am I lacking? Are you able to break down what that actually looks like and the signs to look out for if you're actually needing more of that kind of rest?
Absolutely. So let's start, shall we, with physical rest. So physical rest actually takes 2 forms. It can be passive or it can be active. Now, passive might look like sleeping, having a nap, but active physical rest can mean gentle movement, stretching, things that allow you to connect to your body, to rest the muscles. The second is that mental rest, where it feels like you're actually taking a step back and allowing that brain to decompress in a day. And that's where the brain dump can be really handy. Emotional rest is where you feel that you can stop absorbing other people's issues. And that can mean taking a step away for yourself again. And then we can see sensory rest. And this is one that's huge in our society. Sensory rest is where you actually allow yourself to step away from the notifications, the distractions, the social media of it all. And then social rest. Now, people, when they think social rest, Ashani, what do you think when you think social rest?
Well, it's funny because it feels a bit of like an oxymoron, because when I think of social, I think of I need to be on. You know what I mean? Like I have to be on to be able to socialize. So social rest, I'm a bit like, is it that you take time away from people because you need to recharge?
So you're actually spot on in part 1. There's 2 pieces to social rest. One piece is that taking a step away from social engagements and having that time for yourself can be really important. The second piece of social rest is connecting with the people who light you up, who bring that sense of joy, that fire, that spark into your life. That's just as important as taking time for yourself. So that's social rest. And I love really engaging with that one. Spiritual rest is something that, if faith is an important part of your life, that's where spiritual rest can be really important, re-engaging with your faith and spiritual practices. If not spiritual, from a religious perspective, even engaging with nature, sitting in nature can feel really connected. And that's where another form of spiritual rest can be important. And the last is creative rest. Now, creative rest can look like doing a little clay pot on a Friday afternoon, because why not? There's so many of them that are out there. Doing crochet, which is one thing that I've recently really loved doing. Paint by numbers is another amazing one. That can be, so creative rest can look like creating, so which is output. And creative rest can also look like consuming. And when I say consuming, I mean consuming beauty, nature, awe. Look, when was the last time you looked at a piece of artwork and went, wow? Because that actually requires the time, patience, energy to really stop and see what's out there. So those are the 7 different types of rest.
I love that. Oh my goodness. I feel like there's a lot of gaps for me when I think about the different kinds of rest. So I feel like I've got some homework to do after this episode. I know you kind of unpacked it a little bit around rest and how people really struggle with it. But how do we even know if we're truly resting or just doing a poor job of it because our minds won't switch off?
I think the clearest signal is how you feel when you come back into your daily life. So if you are re-engaging with the people around you, the things in your life with a greater sense of tolerance, you're thinking clearer, or it feels like the frustrations that you had weren't spiking you as much as they used to, then we can say, yeah, I think you did get some solid rest. But If you feel like you need another weekend to recover from the weekend that was just gone, that's when we know that something's likely gone wrong. And there's also a useful question that I like to ask of the clients that I work with, and it's this. During that time off, were you actually physically in one place and mentally somewhere else? Because your nervous system doesn't get a holiday from where your mind is. So if your body is at the beach, but your head's in the inbox, sorry to say it, but you spent the day at the inbox.
Yeah, that is so, oh my goodness. Yeah, this is really good. And it can be really hard to switch off the mind because we are like constantly hustling and moving at such a fast pace. And it's interesting too, because you were kind of speaking to around, even after having a lazy weekend or, resting by the beach, we can still feel exhausted. So, my question is, why do so many people, even after a full night's rest or, they've had a lazy weekend, they're still feeling like they are exhausted than even before?
Yeah, I think that a few things can actually be going on here. The first and probably most obvious one would be sleep quality. We know that the number of hours that you spend in bed does not actually equal the amount of recovery that you would have had. And what the sleep research describes is that the brain cycles through various stages throughout the night. And those deep stages is where the real repair actually happens within our body. And when stress levels are high during the day, or you've consumed alcohol or other substances, you can feel like you've clocked the 8 hours and barely touched any of those deep stages at all. The other thing that I like to think of is what we call the come down effect. Now, when your system has been running flat out for weeks, day in and day out, the weekend can actually feel flat as opposed to restful. And sometimes it can feel for some people worse than the working week. And that's because your body has been running on so much stress that when that drops, you're sitting there wondering what's going on. And it might feel almost like a withdrawal. There's also one last thing that I want to mention here, and it was the term lazy weekend. Ashani, a lazy weekend isn't always a restful one, because if it still involves decision-making, family logistics, social navigation, or hours where you're scrolling on your phone, you're still in input mode. It's just a different version of it.
Wow. Yeah. So it's like we think that we're resting, but we're actually still not resting.
That's right.
It's really hard. Like, do you find even with the clients that come into your clinic that they really struggle with it? Like they're trying to do the things, but they kind of hit a bit of a wall?
Absolutely. Ashani, did anyone ever teach you how to rest?
Definitely not.
That's the thing. In this society we're in, we're taught how to be productive. There are 1,000,001 videos about how to be in the top 1% of high performers, etc. But who teaches you how to rest? Who teaches you what downtime really looks like and how it tailors to who you are as a person? We're kind of all just blindly going about things, hoping that it'll work out.
So it feels like, we are bombarded with this hustle culture. Like, we haven't been taught how to rest. Like that is true, what you were saying before. So how do societal expectations make rest feel like a luxury we can't afford?
I think that there's a really deep cultural narrative here that's definitely ties our worth to our output. That is old. You can trace it back through religious work ethics, through to industrial capitalism, to where we are now. And modern work culture has really amplified that. And social media has made it so hyper visible in a way that it never used to be. And I think that we live in a society that treats busyness as a badge, saying the term, oh, I've been flat out, or have you been, busy? It feels like it's a badge you wear with pride. And there is a form of implicit hierarchy to this. If you're not exhausted, are you trying hard enough? If you have time to rest, are you ambitious? Are you doing the things? And the cruel part, the truly cruel part of this is that logic is endless. There is always more to do. That to-do list, the moment you tick it off and feel that deep sense of satisfaction, guess what? Another 20 items are going to pop up in the next hour.
So true.
you're never going to reach that finish line where that rest feels like you've truly earned it. And that means that the operating system that you're running on sets up in such a way that rest is essentially impossible. And when rest gets framed as something you have to earn by working hard first, people start treating it like a reward for good behavior. Think about the way that we would teach a child about what good behavior looks like, or teaching an animal, for example. That's fundamentally what we would call a category error, right? Rest is a biological requirement. It is a need to have, not a nice to have. You don't earn the right to drink water. You drink because your body needs it. And this is the same principle with rest.
That's so true. It's really interesting because I'm constantly reflecting on my relationship with rest as we're talking. And it's fascinating because what you were saying around how we use rest as a reward system, I've definitely done that. And it's kind of, everything comes back to our childhood, right? And how, I witnessed the way that my parents were, they worked really hard and then they would rest as a reward. So it's kind of like it gives us an opportunity to think about, how was rest actually modeled growing up? And how do we actually start to change that? Because it is hard when it's so deeply ingrained.
Exactly right. And particularly when there is a sense that guilt and rest are connected together, they become learned responses, which can just make it so much more difficult to break away from that and see rest as its own entity.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting you actually talking about guilt, because I was going to ask too, why do so many of us feel guilty or anxious during downtime? Because we're spending so much time thinking that we're wasting time instead of just recharging.
Yeah, absolutely. I think most of us absorbed that lesson, that guilt and anxiety during rest as a learned response. We feel like it's a part of our wiring now, as opposed to something that was taught to us. And as you said, Ashani, I can relate. Growing up in a household where busyness is equated with a sense of virtue, that carries a very early template. And that template is stillness is suspicious. And people who've spent years in really high pressure careers also absorb a very similar message at a workplace level too. I think that there's a personal piece to this as well. When you stop moving, you have to be yourself. And for many people, there are so many feelings that come with sitting in that state of who we are, and all of the feelings that we've been outrunning. That might be grief, sadness, anger, frustration, dissatisfaction with how our life is. And we haven't allowed ourselves the space to look at it because we kind of don't want to. And so then rest actually feels threatening because it forces me to kind of face what it is, and I'd rather not. And so in that regard, busyness becomes a coping strategy as opposed to a productivity one.
Yeah, wow. When you talk about busyness, and I know you've kind of started to talk about this around mental rest, and how we really do need to take that time to unplug. But my question is how does the constant mental overload, like the endless notifications or the endless to-do list where there's 20 new items that pops up, how does that trick our brain into actually taking real recovery?
I think that our brains have a really limited amount of focused attention that we can spend each day. I like to think of it, one of the metrics is like a decision-making meter that you have at the beginning of the day. It might be full depending on how much sleep you've had or how much rest you've gotten. And it depletes throughout the day. And the sort of concentration that you'd need in that focused attention might look like being in a meeting or reading a complex email or decision-making, as I said. And because that depletes throughout the day, it actually needs uninterrupted quiet to refill that meter back up. Now, when we fill every single gap with input, whether that's a podcast in the car, this is a great one, background TV, or even a quick scroll between meetings, we never actually give our system that chance to refill itself. We keep drawing on a tank that we're never fully topping up. And scrolling is actually one of those things that feels quite passive. I'm I'm lying on the couch, just on my phone.
Yeah. Doom scrolling.
Like,
Yeah.
that's right. But your brain is actually working so hard through everything that's on the screen. There's bits of fascinating research on how quickly our eyes scan the various elements of a screen through every millisecond of content that we're consuming. That might include faces, emotional tones, comparison between the person we look at, even the captions that we're reading, the audio as well that we're consuming. And that's a really significant cognitive load on us as people. And this is where that idea of sensory rest kicks in, because so many of us are saturated with that input from the moment we wake up to the very moment that we go to sleep. There's no recovery time built in. So the brain reaches the end of the day never having really stopped. And then, Ashani, we expect sleep to do all of the work for us. But sleep can't actually carry that entire load on its own. It's too much.
What is the impact of always having a full mental inbox? Like, can you walk us through what could happen to someone if they're not going to make any changes?
There's a really well-documented finding in the psychology research on the fact that the mind holds incomplete tasks in a kind of background loop, and it keeps them active in your system even when you're trying to do something else. Do you remember how I said earlier that the brain is for creating ideas but not for storing them? When you're trying to rest with those 17 open loops, the 40 background tabs in the phone battery, your brain's going to keep circling back to them. So rest is going to keep getting interrupted from the inside here. And that's why I recommend the brain dump situation, because the alternative is to picture your mind like a kitchen bench. Every unfinished task, every unresolved conversation, every single thing that you've been meaning to do sits on that bench, and it actually takes up space whether you're actively looking at it or not. So the only way to really be able to breathe and start fresh is to clear that kitchen bench by placing all of the items in a designated spot and then giving yourself the time and space to sort through those items and work out what goes where.
Yeah, that's really good. And I can imagine as well, because even like, I know you're talking about brain dumping as well. Like, if we just offload everything onto a page, I can imagine that being also quite challenging, not wanting to just do the thing straight away. Because I know for me, I can be a go-getter and an overachiever, and I'm like, you know what, maybe I'll just do the list and then I'll rest. So is that kind of where we have to give ourselves a bit more compassion and grace to be like, this might take time?
Absolutely. One of the pieces of feedback that I have consistently received when asked to do a brain dump is this is really confronting. The sheer volume of tasks, whether that's a today task, I should have done it yesterday task, or a maybe I'll do this in 10 years task. Every single thing on that piece of paper that's been floating around in your head for so long, it's quite confronting, which is why immediately after doing a brain dump, you have to step away. The moment you get caught in the weeds is where it gets overwhelming. And guess what? Then we say, I don't want to do any of this. Your brain then goes, I can't trust the brain dump. I'm going to re-download everything back again.
Yeah.
So you have to take that step away to allow yourself to have that breather, the sense of accomplishment of, hey, I did the brain dump. I did the thing. Then we come back and we sort through. And of course, compassion and grace is always going to be a critical piece of this puzzle.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. It's really good. I feel like we've already covered a lot of ground, really unpacking, what actually is rest and, why it doesn't feel restorative, and also the guilt that can come when we're trying to rest as well and the impacts of that. And I think something that I do want to kind of unpack more, because I think so many people are very stressed out. We've all got very high cortisol levels, and, burnout is a real thing. So something I do just want to ask you, because, you specialize in burnout. What are some of the signs of burnout or the stages of burnout? Because I know that people don't want to be burnt out, and we are so busy and connected, and we need to survive. So, yeah, could you give us a bit of a framework around that?
Yeah, burnout is a term that we're talking about a lot more in today's society, and I'm so glad for it because the essence of burnout is to be working for an extended period of time without sufficient recovery. That is the essence of the term burnout.
Mm.
And so, in the simplest form of itself, what it means is you're working too long, too hard, and you haven't allowed yourself a break in between. A burnout can take several forms. We know that there are physical forms of burnout, for example, the fatigue, and that's physical fatigue to the point where you feel like you can't get out of bed. There's the mental fatigue where it feels like you've hit brain fog and you can't think properly. You feel like you can't get the sentences out. People report to me that I've forgotten the word. I can't remember what the word is. And that's that state of brain fog. And that then can clock into some of the emotional elements where there's frustration within yourself. I used to be able to do X, Y, Z. Why have I hit this roadblock now? And long term, that will have impacts on your sleep. And we know that when your sleep gets impacted, a lot of other things will get impacted in your life. When we start to feel burnt out, we start to notice that the things we enjoy doing in our lives start maybe not bringing us as much joy, or because we're so tired, we stop doing them. And then that feeds the cycle as well of feeling dissatisfied, feeling low. Another piece to burnout that I wanted to mention here is that it's not always about high pressure doing too much. Sometimes burnout can also kick in when you're not doing enough of what really lights you up. And there's another phenomenon called bore out, which Adam Grant's been speaking about recently, which is this idea that when we're feeling dissatisfied and feeling like there's a lack of sense of purpose for what's going on in our life, we can exhibit a lot of the similar symptoms to burnout as well.
So interesting when you add that perspective, because when you think about burnout, it's more like you want to manage it, but then it also is an opportunity to reflect and be like, oh, what can I give myself to be able to generate more joy in my life?
Yeah, absolutely. That's right.
Yeah, I love that. And it's interesting because, I think cortisol obviously is something that, when we have high cortisol from stress, like that basically hijacks our ability to rest, right? And does that kind of come back to that mental overload that you were talking about before?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we take a look at cortisol for a moment, I think that cortisol can sometimes actually get cast as like a villain in the wellness
Yeah, it
content.
does.
It really does. And I think that that framing can actually miss to an extent what we know about the stress and sleep research. Cortisol is actually really, really important. And it is something that we need in our bodies because it plays a role in regulating our blood sugar, our immune response, our blood pressure. It's also the thing that allows us to wake up in the morning. So your cortisol spikes in the morning and that's what gets you out of bed. And people with too little cortisol actually get really unwell. And so the hormone itself is doing really important work in our body. But where it gets into trouble is what happens when the system is under a chronic state of stress. So in a really well-regulated system, your cortisol is going to rise in the morning. That allows you to have that spike that gets you ready to go. And then throughout the day, it's going to gradually drop. And once it settles at its lowest point in the evening, that's what allows us to feel that rest to go to sleep. And that curve, that's what gives the body the switch from active mode to that recovery mode in the evening. But under chronic stress, the curve actually flattens or it gets quite disrupted. And when that cortisol stays elevated when it should be dropping, the body reads that as a signal that it's not safe to stop. It's not safe to rest yet. And that is part of the reason why sleep quality then suffers, because your body says, I need to stay awake and alert to keep you alive because it's not safe for you to rest your eyes and fully sleep. So what actually happens then is that lack of sleep produces more stress. Impacts your sleep, produces more stress. It feeds itself.
Wow. It's really, that makes a lot of sense though, because I definitely, when I've when I had like a crazy deadline at work, right? Or something the next day that I know that it's a big day at work, I notice there's sometimes a pattern where, first of all, I might have dreams about work and like things going wrong. I'm like, oh my gosh. But then I do notice that I do wake up earlier in throughout the night. And now I'm just having the insights being like, oh, I was just stressed. My cortisol
Yeah.
levels were just high. They didn't have that recovery time to dip.
That's right. That's right. And I think it's really important to always give thanks, which sounds so counterintuitive
Yeah.
because I want to be able to go to sleep. But the body is doing what it thinks is right to keep you alive. That's its primary function. That's all it's really there to do. So to give thanks and say, I appreciate that you thought I was unsafe, and that's part of the reason why you kept me alert. And it's okay. We can rest now. That second piece.
Yeah.
Thank you. And it's okay. The body feels heard, and that can play a role in quietening it down too.
Okay, well, I feel like, we have really unpacked a lot about, rest, stress, all of it. And I think, I know a lot of our listeners are probably listening right now and being like, okay, what do I do? Give me the practical elements. So what are some simple techniques that you've even recommended to clients to actually make rest restorative and rejuvenative?
Love this question. Let's dive into it. So the very first one that I love recommending all the time is what I call a transition ritual. Now, what that is it's something deliberate, intentional, and consistent that you do that signals to your system that we are changing gears now. Now, it doesn't need to be elaborate, doesn't need to be time consuming. But some of those examples might look like a short walk after work, a cup of tea or matcha that we make with intention, and 10 minutes outside even before dinner. A really tangible one that I might suggest to clients, those of us who are commuting to work, once you've finished your work day and you've jumped into your car, you've popped your bags down, allow yourself 60 seconds to take a couple of deep breaths and then get yourself ready to say, I'm driving home now. And then when we get home, before we get out of the car and back into the rest of our lives, allow yourself another 60 to 90 seconds just for those couple of deep breaths. And then ask yourself, how do I want to show up for the people I love that I'm about to step into this home with? Or if there's nobody in the house, how do I want to show up for me as the person I want to be in my home, my safe space? That is a beautiful transition ritual that really intentionally tells your body, we've switched, we're not in that state anymore. And over time, that ritual actually becomes a cue. So your system actually anticipates that it's going to come as well, which makes it easier. The second strategy that I love suggesting is spending time in environments that hold our interest without demanding much from us. And the simplest example of that is being in nature. And that might mean being in nature without headphones, terrifying concept. I go everywhere with my headphones, but sometimes I will challenge myself to take them off. It might mean, puttering about in the garden, and that's what we call attention restoration. So basically, that's allowing ourselves time for the attention to drift. People will often say that bored time is when they're most creative. That's when some of the most incredible ideas come to us. And that's where creative rest comes from in that framework that I mentioned, because your brain actually needs exposure to beauty, to awe, to nature, and unstructured wandering that has nothing to do with productivity. And the last one that I want to suggest here, it's almost insultingly simple. And it is that if we don't schedule rest, it won't happen. And so there is an element of protecting time for rest in the way that you would schedule a work meeting in. And I sometimes call it grace space. I might call it a self date. whatever the language is that works for you to tell you this is my time for me. Me, one of my best friends has the term me first, then everyone else. And I absolutely
I
love that
love
because it
that.
allows you to zone into here so that we can give outwards to others.
And with that one, I mean, there's so many great tips in this. And it's interesting because when you talk about scheduling in rest, like, do you advise that we, schedule this in every day? Like,
Mhm.
or is that just not, that's just probably impossible, right?
Is it?
Well, I mean, it's really hard because, like, I think about people who have like a full schedule, right? And I'm not a parent myself, but you go from work and then you go home and then you got to take care of the kids. So is it like literally just an hour aside? It's not like you have to get a big chunk of time.
Yeah, absolutely. Remember how I said it doesn't need to be elaborate? We
Mm,
feel like a calendar needs to be an hour. But if you look at the Google Calendar, you can set it for however long you want.
true.
And if 90 seconds is all you have, that's fine. That's
Mm,
90 seconds for you that you otherwise had not scheduled. And when we start doing those things, as I said, for example, taking a couple of deep breaths while the kettle's boiling, that's rest. That's time for you. And it might feel unscheduled in that you don't put into the calendar 90 seconds while the kettle's boiling. But once you start doing those things over and over again, your body starts preparing itself for, hey, you haven't done that thing. Can we do that thing, please? Because it made
mm,
me feel better the last time I did it. So we start learning and relearning that mental muscle that gets built within us to
mm.
keep doing the things. So it really doesn't have to be an hour, but scheduling in even 90 seconds, 5 minutes in a day. If we don't have 5 minutes in a day, we have a very different conversation we need to be having here.
Yeah, I feel like that kind of makes it a bit realistic for people who, yeah, just are constantly go, go, go as well. Yeah, I love that. And it was interesting too, because I think when you were talking about the transitional ritual, I thought that was I really love that because I guess there'll be some people tuning in who work from home or work for themselves as well. So I guess their ritual would just be maybe going outside. I know for me, my ritual usually is like having a shower, like cleansing myself with water. It's a thing. And then getting into some cozy clothes, especially because now it's getting colder. It signals to my brain we're not in work stuff anymore. We're moving into cozy vibes. So I really like that. And everyone, I guess, will find their own flavor of what that looks like.
Yeah, that's right. I absolutely love that you brought up our work from home friends. I think that as someone who also works from home, having those transitions can be really key for home, particularly if your work environment and your every other day life environment can merge itself together.
Mm.
So I love the shower analogy. That was fantastic. I always suggest to my clients wear work clothes even though you're at home because that
Mm.
signals to your brain, I'm in workspace now. Doesn't need to mean you put your shoes on, for example, but enough that tells your brain, I'm in workspace. And then at the end of the workday, when you transition out of those clothes into your rest of your life clothes, that also tells the brain, hey, we've transitioned out. When I've run trainings before, some people have actually said that at the end of a workday in their Teams chat, they will put up a particular song and that triggers to the group that we're tapping out for the
Oh, I
day.
love
And
that. That's
and
fun.
it's actually called like a shutdown ritual is something that I'll call as
Oh,
well.
I
And
love
so at the
that.
end of a workday, you might say something nice to yourself and then close the laptop. One thing that I like doing is at the end of a workday, I have a little notebook and I write 3 things that I'm proud of myself for today. And it might not necessarily be about my clients. It might genuinely just be, I stood outside in the sun for 10 seconds and I'm proud of myself for that. Or I had lunch today and I'm proud of myself for that. And I
Yes.
write those 3, fold it and put it away. And I don't read them again. And that's not that the point isn't to read them again. The point is in that moment, I gave myself that breath, wrote the things, folded it away. That's the transition. Now I start the rest of my day.
I really love this because it's essentially signaling how, yeah, we got to be more intentional and try to slow down and just be more mindful and also celebrate ourselves for doing those small micro changes.
Absolutely. I'm always here for celebrating ourselves.
Yeah, definitely. But Shaktika, what happens if someone's like, yeah, but I still feel really restless? Like, can you give us one quick psychological hack to reset Our nervous system.
The one hack that I'm going to suggest is what we call this physiological sigh. Now, it's one of the best supported reset techniques that we have in the literature, and it requires absolutely nothing of you but your breath. It's really, really simple. What you do is you take one inhale through your nose, and then you take a second sharper inhale, and then you follow it up with a long, slow exhale through your mouth. So let me say that again. You'll do an inhale through your nose, and then another sharp inhale, and that fills up your lungs completely, and then a long, slow exhale through your mouth. Now, what the research shows is that exhale part is where your body puts that biological brake on the stress response, because your body can't stay in a stress state and do an exhale at the same time. So that's why I absolutely love the physiological sigh, and I recommend it to anybody I meet. I'm that person at a dinner party that will throw that tip in for anyone who will listen. But Ashani, I want to leave the listeners with one last thing. And it is that before you change anything in your schedule, I want you to audit your relationship with rest itself, because that is where the leverage actually is. And I want you to think on 3 questions. When did I last feel rested in a way that actually made me feel held? What were the conditions that actually made that possible? And what would have to change in order for those conditions to exist more often in my everyday life? Because we know that perpetual exhaustion is almost always a sign that the system that we're running on needs a closer look, because somewhere in there, there's a gap between what we say we value, like our health, our relationships, our inner life, and how we're actually spending our time. And closing that gap takes real courage. It means looking honestly at the patterns that we've built and asking which ones we want to keep and which ones we want to let go of. And I do genuinely believe that rest belongs in that conversation. We want to treat it as a foundation that lets us to live the life that we say we want. And a lot of the rest follows from there.
Beautiful. I love that. I feel like we've got a lot of homework, but restful homework to do. So thank you so much for just sharing your wisdom with us today. I'm leaving this conversation with many takeaways. So thank you again for your time.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land and waters on which this podcast was recorded.